welcome, and we appreciate your attendance today. Had no idea. We thought maybe there'd be 2 or 3, or at least our spouses might be here. This is just great. I think it's only appropriate to ask Pastor Janine to come up and open our program with a prayer.
Thank you, Ross, and we're so glad to have you here. Let's vow for prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this community and for the many communities of faith that have been part of the history of this area. And we just give you thanks for those who are here today and ask that you would bless us with understanding and with your presence. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
2 of us have taught in the public schools for many years. I'm joined today in presenting this with Kris Hubbard and Myrna Hill. We each have our own kind of topics. There's so much history, 140 years. The Methodist Church has been organized here in the community of Sturgis. And I hate to say it, but I've been here for about half of those. However, I see a lot of people out here who have been here longer than that. So I'm afraid if I make a mistake, they will catch me. So, for sure. I need to thank all those in our church who came before us, the excellent records they kept. It was a pretty easy chore for us to go through and sort the material out. We've divided this up a little bit. I am taking the physical churches, kind of trying to go through the history of that, and Kris and Myrna will take the missions, because that's, to me, that's the main part of what a church is. What are the missions of that church? We had so many of them, we had to divide it up. So I think I want to thank Dorothy Getsko, probably more than anyone, who kept excellent records, and everything was there. All I had to do was read it and try to remember it a little bit, and hopefully this makes sense to you. What I did is I divided up, or created a timeline for the history of our Sturgis First United Methodist Church, starting in 1876. Lest we think we've been around here a long time, don't forget the natives of this area considered this sacred spiritual ground for centuries before that. The existence of Bear Butte and the Black Hills, certainly their spiritual guidance was long before any of the churches here in Sturgis. One of the great resources is our church has celebrated anniversaries, and this is from the 65th anniversary back in 1947. And so I'm going to start by reading just a little bit from that. The first preaching of the gospel in the Black Hills was by the Reverend Henry W. Smith, now generally known as Preacher Smith. He was an ordained minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church, came here of his own accord. On Sunday, May 7, 1876, the records show that he preached in a log house with sawdust floors at Custer. He left Custer on May 22nd and preached in the camp at Box Elder, evening of May 25th. The first record of his preaching at Deadwood is on Sunday, July 9th, 1876. He supported himself, move my note here, by his labor and preached in the cabins of the miners or in the crowded streets. It was no uncommon sight to see him holding the attention of one end of a crowd while the men of this world were working the other end. While but very few followed his counsel, he was held in universal respect by the sturdy miners. Sunday, August 20th, 1876, while attempting to go to Creek City to preach, he was killed just outside of Deadwood. His body was buried in the old cemetery. Later, it was removed and with appropriate services was interred in a beautiful lot at Mount Moriah. Our church didn't start in 1876, but certainly the first Methodist minister was here in the hills. A few years after that, the 1880s, was followed by what we call the Black Hills Mission of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And again, reading from the 65th anniversary. So much interested was, well, let's see here. Reverend W.D. Pfeiffer was next experiment organizing a class of supporters. The Reverend W.D. Pfeiffer was next sent and held 2 meetings, also assisting in an entertainment for a parsonage fund, which netted $76. Its circumstances were peculiar. It was held in W.H. Harmon's warehouse among threshing machines, cracker barrels, and hosts of people. White people, black people, Chinese, Mexicans, and soldiers. A regular appointment was established, a ladies' aid society formed, and considerable zeal manifested. On the 18th of March, 1882, 2 years after this Black Hills Mission was organized, the Reverend J.I. Bartholomew took charge of the work. He also served in Galena. On March 22nd, a church was organized with 12 members. Now here's the interesting part. A valuable corner lot and building were purchased on Main Street for a temporary church. The first meetings were held in this building, which at one time had been used as a saloon. It is located on the site of the present post office, which we now know as the Motorcycle Museum. So, maybe church attendance was really good back then. Who knows? A few years later, a new church building was built, where a lot was purchased. The new church building was completed in the spring of 1887. On our present site, which obviously is at the corner of Howard and Cedar now, and was dedicated on May 4th during a severe blizzard. W.E. Jones, father of Helen James Wood and grandfather of Dr. W.E. Jones, started to come to the dedication from his sawmill in the hills, but the storm blew the top off his carriage and caused him to turn back. Moving on to 1903, the first parsonage well, that's obviously a picture of the first church. There we go. In 1903, the parsonage was completed. We have a total of 71 members. By 1906, plaster in the top of the ceiling in the church had to be replaced by a brand new metal ceiling. 1909, there were considerable improvements inside and outside of the church. And again, reading now from the 75th anniversary, the Reverend Herbert L. Case, pastor from 1909 to 1912, father of U.S. Senator Case, tells that returning home from a layman's ministry conference, he found a letter from the superintendent, Robert Dolliver, asking him to come to Sturgis. This is considered a call from God. To pay for his moving expense from Marathon, Iowa, 600 miles, he sold his driving horses. he found Sturgis filled with homesteaders, some of whom were in his congregation almost every Sunday, from claims out 40 to 100 miles.
Ross,
Yes,
you know, I have a second case as a pastor here as well. Janine's maiden name was Case.
I did not know that. Coincidence? Any relation?
Not that I know.
Not that you know. That's good to know that. We'll have to put that down. Wow. 19,
Her name is not hyphenated because if it was, it would sound like a case of oil. I got one.
got more? Okay. By 1917, the value of the church building was given as $2,000 and the parsonage as $1,000. So that was the original church along with the original parsonage. We'll get back to that a little bit later on. In 1937, the church observed its 55th anniversary, and Congressman Francis Case gave the address. 1939 to 44, again reading from the 75th anniversary booklet. Dean Hadley came that the project was actually started, with Dean as foreman and chief worker, with many willing helpers with great faith, and with $173 in the building fund, the church was raised 42 inches. That's the bottom portion of the old church that sits at the corner of Howard and Cedar. It was blocked up on timbers and the basement dug. The foundations and floors put in. The building was now valued at $8,000. A little later, the church schoolrooms were built, pastor's study equipped, furnished by Senator Case in honor of his father. The church valuation was raised to $10,000. Next, the tower was built, ladies' parlor, kitchen, dining room, chapel, balcony, and improved chancel. And new entrants from all came in under raising the estimated value of the building to $12,000. Jumping ahead to 1952 to 53, the membership at that time sat at 310. By that time, the chancel had been enlarged, new paneling had been put in, fluorescent lights installed, blonde pews and chancel furniture, along with outside electric lighted bulletin board erected. 1955, a new parsonage was built. It was valued at $20,000. By 1960, first youth were sent on the United Nations seminar. I'm sure we'll cover that a little bit later on. That same year, 1960, 9 lots were purchased across the street from the church. And that would be where the new high-rise sits. Purchased basically that whole block.
Does that show the purchase price of those lots?
I assume it did. 1970, a lot of you can remember that. The old parsonage was torn down and the annex was completed in 1971. Reading again from this brochure. In June of 1970, the old parsonage was torn down by Ted Williams. Construction began at the old parsonage site on the new United Methodist Annex. That's the brick building you see there. Building was completed in December of 1971, increasing value of the church property to $162,000. That includes the church, the annex, equipment, furniture, and the parsonage. In 1994, 12 acres were purchased for this new church here on Ballpark Road. By 2001, construction had started on the church. In 2002, the first service in our new church was held on Easter Sunday, April 15th, 2002. 2003, just the next year, the old church was sold to the Assembly of God. Since then, we have, in 2008, we purchased a new parsonage in the Allison edition, and that kind of brings us up to the present time. What was interesting in researching a lot of this is there were a certain amount of contradictions, typographical errors, a lot of things. I had the hardest time finding out when we had purchased the new parsonage, which is the most recent thing. Thanks to Janine, we got that figured out. So, at this time, I'll ask Kris to come up and talk about one of the major missions in our church, the Mother-Daughter Banquet.
Okay, as Ross said, I'm here to talk about the Mother-Daughter Banquet. The Sturgis United Methodist Church sponsored Mother-Daughter Banquet was held for 85 years. The first in 1932 and the last in 2017. As I just said, the first Mother-Daughter Banquet was in 1932, May 6th to be exact. And it was held at the Methodist Episcopal Church of Sturgis with 100 people in attendance. The menu included breaded veal, potatoes, scalloped tomatoes and pickles, with ice cream and cake for dessert. A toast to mothers and daughters was given. A song was sung by Mrs. Cosart and her daughter, with a response by Mrs. Sparks. Several readings and/or skits were given, including Making Mother Happy and A Mother's Love. In 1934, the event was held at the Methodist Church. And the musical program included a piano solo, several readings, a vocal solo, and more group songs. The printed program, as you see, referenced the location inside of the program as the Methodist Church, not the Methodist Episcopal Church, as it was previously known. The 8th annual Mother-Daughter Banquet on May 2nd, 1940 was again held at the Methodist Church. The Hour of Charm was the title of the program. The menu consisted of hot chicken salad, green beans, sweet potato mounds, butter rolls, radish roses, jelly, pickles, angel cake with lemon sauce, coffee, mints, and nuts. The stage was decorated as a radio station with its call letters spelling charm, standing for the first letters of the musical entertainment as follows. C, Charming Mother, sung by Miss Jackie Cosart. H, Happy Daughter by Mrs. Ralph Rich. A Reverie of Mother McCree. R, Rhythm by the Band. And M, a reading titled My Mother's Hands. The first newspaper article about the event was in 1946 for the 14th annual. The theme that year was Fairyland. According to the newspaper, and I quote, after the invocation by Mrs. Reuben Tanquist, the Fairyland menu prepared by the elves was served so willingly and efficiently by the men as to win approval of the fairy queen. End quote. That menu included steak fried by the elves, potatoes by the queen fairy, corn, witch's relish, and brownies brew with fairy's delight in silver cups for dessert. The 20th annual banquet in 1952 was given by the Women's Society and Wesleyan Service Guild of the Methodist Church, and it was held at City Auditorium. I should point out that the mother-daughter banquet was held at the church until 1948, when it was moved to City Auditorium. A circus theme was carried out for this banquet, and it was carried out with the table and stage decorations and also the program. According to the local newspaper, it was the largest event ever held here, with an attendance of 515 people. Mrs. Jo DeJarlis was the toastmistress of the evening, and Mrs. Roy Hardy gave the invocation. During the program, a tribute was paid to mothers present who were 25 years of age and older, a tradition that continued to the end. The 32nd Mother-Daughter Banquet in 1964 was titled Starlight, Starbright, and featured pantomime, dance, narrations, and vocal numbers. Mrs. Oakley Lamphere was the toastmistress, while Margaret Jones narrated the program. Mrs. Robert Behrens was accompanist for the vocalists, and I'm quoting from a news article, Madames Don Hawley, Earl Ferguson, Gerald Holman, A.A. Lushbaugh, Floyd Phillips, David Richards, John Stoddard, and Ted Williams were hostesses. Now that was 1964, and they still could not refer to the women by their own name. Syncopated Styles was the theme for the 39th Mother-Daughter Banquet in 1971. Following a dinner of ham, referred to as pink pom-poms in the printed program, the Methodists entertained those present with a musical review that retraced the development of women's styles and music from early times to the present. In addition to ham balls, other menu items included brown linen with white lining, baked potatoes, red and gold buttons, corn with pimento, toast and white flannel, rolls, emerald taffeta, molded salad, and white chiffon with pastel satin trim, cake and sauce. Ham balls was again served for the 56th Mother-Daughter Banquet in 1988. The program, Key City Cruise, was led by the cruise director, Lois Mason, and purser, the Reverend Dwayne Knight. 12 musical selections were performed, including Sentimental Journey, On a Slow Boat to China, Moonlight Bay, How Deep Is This Ocean, and North to Alaska. The final song, Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, was performed in costume by Lowell Daniel, Alan Lushbaugh, Bill Jones, Boyd Bloomer, and Bob Sitchloff. The 60th annual banquet was held May 7, 1992. The theme was It's About Time. Acts included Norma Hill and Marge Arian reminiscing about the past with their rendition of Dearie. Heidi Fellner performed the song Memories, while Linda and Gary Nelson sang 3 o'clock in the morning. Other musical selections included Grandfather's Clock, the Syncopated Clock, and Anything Goes. Dancing to Rock Around the Clock were David and Eleanor Richards, Dan and Arlene Watson, and Mike and Carol Fellner. Toastmistress was Bonnie Clark. Jill and Molly Sidgelaw presented the toast to daughters and mothers. There were no handballs this time. Instead, the menu featured chicken breasts. All You Need Is Love, a tribute to the Beatles, was the theme of the 72nd annual Mother-Daughter Banquet in 2004. Songs performed included With a Little Help from My Friends, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Yellow Submarine, Yesterday, Rocky Raccoon, Michelle, Blackbird, Let It Be, When I'm 64, and All You Need Is Love. And yes, again, handballs were served. The 80th Mother-Daughter Banquet was held May 3rd, 2012 at the Sturgis Community Center. What's Cooking was the theme. Baked ham, not handballs, was served. Mike Fellner was the Muppets' Swedish chef in a skit of the same name during that program. And ironically, 3 years later for the 83rd Mother-Daughter program, Fellner impersonated Chef Julia Child in a program titled Time for Relaxing. 2017 was the last year that the Mother-Daughter Banquet was held. The program for that 85th annual event was titled A Trip Down Memory Lane. The finale of that program was the song, Thanks for the Memories. However, some liberties were taken with the words as follows. Thanks for the memories of songs and skits abound. The men always forget the words. The backstage noise, we really hope the audience never heard. How lovely it was. Thanks for the memories of Sturgis Armory walls, of chicken and handballs. 85 years of love and laughs, and we enjoyed it all. We thank you so much. Good night. And that concludes my portion of the program. I will now turn it over to Myrna.
How nice to be here with you this afternoon. I come to this historical perspective with lots of insight. My father was born in 1926, and in 1927, my grandparents moved from Fort Pierce, South Dakota to Sturgis. And so my dad, as an infant, was a part of this church. All four of my grandparents, my folks, aunts and uncles, sisters have all been a part of this Methodist church. So from the time I can remember, I have heard all kinds of stories. Ross and Kris assured me they each had just 10 minutes to present. I think they each took about 15, but now I'm left with everything else to tell you. So I'll see what I can do, and if it gets too long, or give me a heads up here. It is delightful going through this history, and I think the three of us enjoyed getting together mostly because of what we learned as we were researching and wanted to share stories with each other. So it's been hard to whittle things down and get just enough to share with you because, as Ross said, there is so much history. To give you a little bit of perspective, in April it was our 140th anniversary. But the Methodist Church in the United States started in 1784. So it was quite a bit later that all those pioneers and homesteaders got out to Dakota Territory, and Methodism began its establishment in this area. Ross mentioned Preacher Smith is one of the early pastors. I just share that in addition, keep in mind circuit riders who walked or rode horses to get around to all these churches. And when pastors were first appointed to the Sturgis Methodist Church, typically they had multiple charges. So Janine, you just be thankful, you and Martin, for what you've stepped into now compared to what it could have been. I understand at various times pastors served, I think Ross mentioned Galena, but also the Newell, Piedmont, and the Tilford churches as part of their time. So that's kind of neat and good to have the Kenley family here from Tilford area. In 1891, annual conference was held here. Now, annual conference is a big church meeting. Right now, our conference consists of all of North and South Dakota. And I'm not sure what constituted the conference at that time, but Sturgis must have been something else again, based on what I read. And I'm not sure that they met here for good reasons, totally. I found a quote about annual conference in some of the historical documents I found, and so I'm quoting for you, 1891. Sturgis is a very important but difficult field. The gospel is bearing fruit, even in Sturgis. Not sure about that one. 1909, Sturgis area was composed of, I read, mostly homesteaders by now. So Ross talked about the early foundations of the church, but by 1909, homesteaders settling in here, and it said some of those people were in church nearly every Sunday. Times change. In 1925, and I just found this since the last time we met and shared it with Ross today, in 1925, our church had a park on the property. So Ross had shared with you pictures of the brick parsonage that was built in 1955. That land was developed first into a park. And I read it was particularly designed for the young people in the church to have a place to go. Not sure what that was about either. If you came in early and had a chance, on the back tables over here are some old historic artifacts, scrapbooks, things like that you may enjoy looking at after we're done today. But as you leave today, I would point out that I think one of the oldest items that exists on our church property is the bell, out in the bell tower in the front of the church. Ross had already mentioned W.E. Jones, which would be Dr. Bill Jones' grandfather. If you deal with Margie at Northern Hills Vet Clinic, that would be her great-grandfather. I think based on the research and history I've done, they were very philanthropic and gave generously to establish our Sturgis community. Because in some of my historical digging, I believe that was W.E. Jones who also donated the land, kitty corner from their property, where they are now, Jones's Pond, which most of you are probably familiar with, but where the Williams building was built. In that time period, they donated the land for that too. But in 1884, the Jones family donated the bell for the bell tower that's out front. And it was given in memory of W.E. Jones' wife, who died young. I did read, and it was in some notes by Dr. Jones, that his grandfather remarried eventually, and his wife, his second wife, never did like that bell. So notes from Bill. I thought it was delightful. I want to share a little bit about some of the groups, the involvement, and some of the work that's been done in the community in this church. And as a school teacher, my priority would be youth, and so that's what I'm going to start with. From the beginning of the church, 140 years ago, youth were important. Confirmation classes, Sunday school classes, vacation Bible school classes, all of those were held. Also, the church supported strongly the camping program and has done all kinds of mission work at our various and assorted church camps, but in particular, I think there's a fondness for Storm Mountain in the Black Hills. Kind of fun as I read, we have Eleanor Tanquist Richards with us. Eleanor's father was a Methodist pastor here, and so Eleanor lived in the old parsonage. When I came to Sturgis, that parsonage was no longer being lived in, but it was used for Sunday school meetings, it was used for Bible study groups, it was used by the youth groups, and some of you, I think, are old enough that you remember when we used to hold spook houses in that old parsonage, because it was an old building. And so it's extreme support for the youth, I think. Ross mentioned the United Nations trip. This was sponsored by the church at a conference level throughout South Dakota. And every year for, I think, almost 50 years, the church sent youth from this church preference typically given to seniors, but to go for 2 weeks, and then when they started flying, first it was by bus and then they flew, but first for 2 weeks and then a week in Washington, D.C. and New York City, visiting foreign embassies, getting to visit the United Nations, and learning a much broader picture about world politics and what the church's responsibility might be in all of that. To fund that trip, the church ladies, again, here they are, they were funding through a smorgasbord dinner, which I always thought was awesome. And it served food from countries from around the world, but Sturgis style. Ross went on that trip, and are there others here who attended? So Linda, Christy, chaperones on the trip. Excellent, excellent. So good memories of that too, I think. I came across information in 1904 that a junior league was started, and I was not familiar with that. But apparently it was a youth group organization that eventually became junior high and high school MYF, Methodist Youth Fellowship. And so these were organized through the church at large and then trickled down to the small hometown churches. If you were fortunate enough to reach the age of 18 and still be part of the church, I learned another new one. They had a diamond club, and I was not familiar with that. But at the age of 18 until 35, and I assume it came from wearing a diamond on your finger, it was for young couples who wanted to be involved in things in the church and support the church as well. I did find information from Adelaide Donaldson telling about that Sturgis, according to Adelaide, had the very first Sunday school in town. And I don't know if that's true or not. I didn't find anything else about that. But they met typically in the home of pastors or in the homes of church families. And so that was kind of fun to read about. Eventually, there was also formed an Epworth League, which also was geared toward young adults up to the age of 35. So I think that and the Diamond Club must have been very, very similar. The men's group has been active in this church since the early 1960s. Probably their biggest claim to fame for a while at the Sturgis Community Senior Center. They did a dramatization of The Last Supper. And music entertainment was provided with that as well. From the beginning of time, they met early in the morning, and they still do, as far as I know. So contributing to the health and the safety and the goodness of the church. I did read that we had a pastor years back who, when Mr. Jones, who lived by Jones's Pond in the big White House there across from what's now the middle school, when the pond filled up with silt, he needed to have it cleaned out on a regular basis. And the Methodist pastor at that particular time donated his time and said, "I'll come help because you Joneses do so much for the church." And he sneezed as they were cleaning, and his teeth fell into a pile of silt and swampy water that had been cleaned out of that. And Bill Jones told the story that his grandfather just couldn't hold it in and was laughing hysterically as the pastor reached down, wiped off his teeth. Absolutely. Lest we forget also the women of the church, and I think Kris obviously has shared a great deal about the women's involvement in the church, and Ross has as well. But if our church was established 140 years ago in 1882, please note that was also the year that the Ladies' Aid Society was established worldwide for what would become the Methodist Church. And so according to the records I saw from the very get-go, the women of the church were a vital part and were organized, even though it started with just those 12 members. Eventually, in 1940, the Women's Society of Christian Service. Then in 1973, they became the United Methodist Women. And if you did not know it, just this past year, 2022, we have now become the United Women in Faith. And so as changes have come in the Methodist Church, that group, that organization has changed. But their focus has not. The ladies who started that very first organization, it was mission work in India to establish schools and hospitals in some of the most impoverished parts of our world. And so vital work that they did. I also read that it was the women who helped provide pastor's salary at the formation of the church. And so fundraisers were common and frequently held. In 1885, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement came to Sturgis. And so Methodists really hopped on that bandwagon. I'm not sure if that had to do with the foundation with the first church in the bar or what that was all about, but here we are. And a little bit of tidbit history that I was not aware of. I read that in 1910, Carrie Nation came to Sturgis and was here for 2 evenings of revivals that were held through the Methodist Church. And so Carrie Nation was actually here. So something I studied in history books and didn't know that it was so close to home. So a fascinating history that truly has a lot of overlap into all kinds of things happening in the world. Other groups and organizations, we had a Young and Heart group for many years in this church, I believe formed in the 1950s, lasted more than 40 years for some of the older members of the church. In the 1990s, we had a care group that just looked after ministering to the people of the church. Coffee Fellowship has been a part of this church, I think, since its inception as well. And when we're done today, please notice, and we want to thank Joy and Bill Adio, who have set a beautiful table with coffee and some excellent sweets for your afternoon as you visit with each other and maybe look at some of the history. A couple of notable pastors that I want to comment on, because what they left us was invaluable, and that was their children. I mentioned Eleanor Richards, who has been a lifelong member of this church, and Eleanor's father was a Methodist pastor here from 1945 to 1952. She lived in that old parsonage building, and I understand, Eleanor, there was a flood while you lived there, and it floated the furnace right up from the basement through the floor. That old church on Cedar was built on an old creek bed, and when flooding takes place, those waterways typically return to their natural location, and it sounds like you had a lot of water in the house for 24 hours, Eleanor, but you can visit with her about that. And also here, I want to mention Linda Moberly, chaplain, and Linda's father served this church as well, and so Linda was one of the byproducts of his service here, and we've got to keep her around. Another one that I think was kind of interesting, Harold Fish served this church. And if you remember Harold, he's more recent, but a large, rather imposing figure of a man. And I think his claim to fame in the community was that he was a football fanatic, and the kids were fascinated by him because he refereed football games. And so it was good for our youth program at that time. Ross, I'm well over my 15 minutes that you took. Bear with me. I must share a little bit about the choir and music program, and of course I think it is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird where Atticus makes the comment, leave loudness to the Methodists. I was born and raised a Methodist, enough said. Anyway, choir has been a vital part of this congregation, and music as well. I understand Marvel Braden Means had told me that when she first came here, there was an old pump organ that was used and played for many, many, many years. And in 1948, they had a campaign to raise money and bought the first electric organ, a Hammond. And I remember that organ in the church, but also remember that the Meade School District used to, every May for graduation, have baccalaureate ceremony at that time period that was held at Grunwald, and they would transport that organ, the school district transported the organ from the Methodist Church to Grunwald for baccalaureate service, because that's the church service to honor the graduates, and then it would come back to the church. And so quite a process and a claim to fame for that old organ. In 1974, it was replaced by a used organ that the church purchased from the Methodist, or the Presbyterian pastor's wife. Judy White had an organ in her home, was the high school choir director at the time, and our church, when Judy and Chuck moved to a different location, bought Judy's home organ from 1974. That's the current organ that sits in the sanctuary that has electrical problems and no longer works. And so that brings us current with, now what are we going to do about an organ in the church, and is it time to get a new one, or is it time to let that fade out? So interesting, the changes that have happened. The Sturgis Choir has been involved in the community Christmas programs. I found it interesting, and some of you who know Fort Meade history may know this better than I do. We've had a long history of high school band and choir directors being Methodists and helping out at our church as part of our music program, which has been delightful. In my experience, I think of Leo Getzko, Lowell Daniel, Keith Cahoon, Dave Martinson. But in the history I read, from the mid-1920s to the early 1930s, the church choir here was directed by Sergeant Ferretti. And my Italian may not be too good, Ferreti. He was a sergeant stationed at Fort Meade, and he was the band director at the fort, and directed the high school band and the Methodist choir. So interesting as we've shared musical talents over the years. In 1994, a bell choir was established here. Good things that happen in our community, I think of what our community food cupboard has become. I know many of you I know help contribute food, contribute monetarily to that. Some of you I know work there. But interestingly enough, it was started by a Methodist. Not by the Methodist Church, but by a Methodist. Those of you who know and remember Alan Lushbow.
Yes.
Alan served on the county commission, and working as a commissioner saw the need for food in our community. And he established that in the garage at his home. And I don't know what kind of a say Lillian had in that, but Alan was the one behind it. And he started that in the early 1960s. And I understand what prompted it to move to the church was that Alan and Lillian went for 3 years as missionaries to Japan. And so he was not here to supervise and run that, and so he asked the church to take it over, and the church did. And I found in some of the notes, they said one of the biggest years, the demand for the community food cupboard was 1972. And some of you that have been around here a while will remember that that was the year of the flood. And there were so many homes flooded, food lost, people that lost their income or jobs, and that Alan helped line up high school workers who were paid from throughout the community to clean out muck from houses and to help provide food for the people who were hungry, who had lost so much after the flood. So some good things happening there as well. Mission work in this church has always been huge. A little bit of background as far as Methodist Church organization. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but there are only 2 denominations in the world that are worldwide churches, the way they're organized. One is obviously the Catholic Church. We have a Pope who's the head of it. But the other church that falls under worldwide is the Methodist Church. Sometimes I think that's a tremendous blessing. Sometimes I think maybe it's a bit of a curse. A huge blessing in that it is so easy to raise funds worldwide to do great mission work. And the Methodists have done that since inception. It can be difficult at times because of the diverse population, and the Methodist Church is dealing with that right now as it looks into LGBTQ issues, because it's a worldwide church and not just a localized one. But we have sent mission groups to Alaska. Mike has gone to Russia. We have sent people, Leah has been involved with medical mission trips to Honduras. Some of these are organized by the global church, and some of them are just much more local or conference-wide. Many of our youth have gone to the reservations to do mission work there. As I mentioned earlier, also supporting the camping program, but I think that's gone on for many, many years. Our church is used well when we have worship services, youth groups, whatever. But I think many of our churches sit empty too much of the time. And the Methodists, I think, have long been believers that the church was built to be used as a building. The parsonages were built to be used. And so, in recent times, I think of our church being used for some of the following things, to help with local missions. We have a preschool and have had for many years here. Boy and Girl Scouts have met here. TOPS has met here. Church Women United has met here. AARP has used our facilities. The Hospital Auxiliary. The Women's Investment Club, that's been a while ago that they phased out, I believe. PEO has met here. The Delta Kappa Gamma Iota chapter teacher organization has met here. Foster parents meet here. The Red Cross has this designated as an emergency site in case of natural disaster. The city of Sturgis has used our facilities. Funerals, weddings, baptisms, anniversaries, birthday parties are held here. And so many things going on. In closing, I want to share one last story with you, and I was delighted to see Mark come in. Mark's dad was my American history teacher for part of my growing up, a National Honor Society advisor. I loved history, and I shared with Mark earlier to grow up with R.B. Williams in our community and have the history is truly a blessing. But I can remember your dad talking about the Ku Klux Klan, and I was fascinated. And I just wanted to, in closing, tell a little story about the Klan's visit to the Sturgis Methodist Church. This was kind of a hotbed for the Ku Klux Klan because of Fort Meade, with the cavalry and black cavalry people stationed there. And then, of course, this was a very important location for Catholicism in the Catholic Church. And you've already, some of you, visited and heard the history of the old Catholic Church here in town. Some of you might remember Jenny Lundgren. She was a longtime member of this church years ago. But she writes about this event, and this is, I'm going to quote Jenny and read this for you. She wrote this about a 1922 event with some interesting church visitors from Jenny Lundgren. I was a young girl working here in Sturgis. I couldn't go to church on Sunday morning as I had to work Sundays until 2 p.m. At that time, the Methodist Church had evening services, so a girlfriend and I always came to church on Sunday evenings. This certain evening, when the services were about to start, in walked the Ku Klux Klan. They were wearing long white robes, they had masks on their faces, and queer peaked hoods were on their heads. The one, I suppose, was the leader, and he asked the people seated in 2 of the pews to move to other places because the Klansmen wanted to sit together. The people were glad to move, as everyone was uptight, thinking of the Klan coming. Were they here to take someone out of the church? To give someone a beating? Perhaps something worse. Well, things quieted down. The Klan sat quiet while the preacher gave the sermon. But I don't think anyone that night knew what the sermon was about, as everyone was so nervous. When the minister got to the part in the service to ask for the tithes and offerings, the leader got up, went to the pulpit, gave the minister a bag of money, and then went down the aisle toward the door. The rest of the Klan followed, and they left the church. There was such a buzz as people were trying to relax after such an ordeal, end quote. And she says it took time for the pastor to compose the congregation so that service could finish. But she also mentioned as they walked out of the door, front door of the Methodist Church on Cedar Street, they looked up on Sly Hill, and at the top of the hill, by the time the church was out, a cross was burning. The Methodist Church is known for a cross and flame. I hope a burning cross for other reasons. The flame has burned in the heart of many Methodists as they have gone out into the field of service to make the world a better place. And we hope that continues for another 140 years. Thank you for coming to hear our history, and please enjoy some goodies before you leave, because the Methodists always have to have food.
I wonder if I could just say a couple of things. I think I am the oldest member here today, is that right? I've been...
Always gonna argue.
I belonged before you did, Elder. I belonged to this church since I was in the 2nd grade, and many of the events that were described today, I was at them. And those programs up there for mother-daughter, my mom was responsible for those, and I never forgave her for the one with the clown on it, and we had to stick all those dots on those clowns. I mean, she was always coming up with something. But I have been a part of this church forever. I have very dear friends here. Myrna's one of them, all of them. And I guess that most of the stuff was touched on that we did. But I went to NYF, I went to Mitchell, I went to North Dakota, I went everywhere. Every time it was time to go somewhere, I got in somebody's car. Sometimes Eleanor's dad's car, and he used to sing to us all the way, wherever we were going. So these are the things that make this church special. And if you have any questions, you can ask me while we're here, but I might not know the answer.
Well, certainly, if any of you have any questions or comments, Richard?
I have a question. I delivered papers in that neighborhood when I was in high school. When did there was that, the
Bell tower.
bell tower. You didn't say anything about the stinky old bell tower.
Well, yes, I thought.
That was controversial.
I walk by it every day, it stunk.
No, but the bell tower, the old bell tower became useless because of the winds and the storms. And they wanted to keep the bell because it had been part of the church for so long. And so we bought those old poles that were soaked in creosote and built the bell tower in front of the church. And it was quite controversial at the time because it was so ugly and it smelled when you got close to it. At Christmas time, we used to put the crush and the manger seed underneath it to soften it a little bit. But notice we did not bring that bell tower with us to this location.
Yeah,
We do have the bell.
yeah, I got the bell, not the tower.
Well, there's so many things that we've all left out. I mean, obviously, 140 years, there's a lot of memories. Any other, Eleanor, did you? No?
I was 16 when I found out we were going to have to move to Sturgis. It was the worst moment of my life. I really didn't even know where Sturgis was, and I certainly wasn't excited about moving out here. I just want to say I've changed my opinion. It was a great place to grow up and to live, and my dad and mom always said they wished they could have been here a little longer. Dad was given a position at the First Church in Sioux Falls after they'd only been here for about 2.5 years, and they left me behind. But that was all right, that was good, so it's been wonderful.
It was good.
Any other questions?
Yes. I was just wondering if in your research there, you saw what the intention was for the use of the lots that were across the street?
Yeah, the 9 lots that were purchased directly east of our old church, where the high rise is, was thought to be the new location for a new church.
Okay.
And then that didn't materialize, and this property became available, a lot more acreage, and so that was sold. I don't know when that was sold, but yeah, that was, the intent was that was where the new church would have been.
Ross, do you remember when we started, the first time we started, we didn't have enough money, and so we had to stop and have these big meetings and explain everything to everybody why we were going to build a new church. And here it is, but it was a rough start.
It always is. Anything worthwhile, though, is to see the outcome of it. Well, again, we have refreshments for you. On that back table are some news articles, papers, pictures of some of that. You're certainly welcome to look at that. Again, thank you all so very much for coming.